Stranded in the desert. Jacob was a man who loved to hike. He liked the quiet, the open land, and the feeling of being free. This time, he decided to hike in the desert. The desert was big and hot. It had high sand dunes and long stretches of dry ground. Jacob felt strong and ready for the trip. He packed his bag with everything he needed: food, a map, a flashlight, and most importantly, water. He knew how important water was in the desert. The sun was bright, and the sky was clear as he walked on the sandy ground. His boots made soft sounds as they touched the sand. The air was dry and hot, but Jacob did not worry. He had done hikes before, and he was sure he would be fine. He followed the trail and enjoyed the quiet. There were no trees, just sand as far as he could see. Sometimes he saw small lizards running over the rocks, but nothing else. It was just him and the desert. After a few hours, Jacob decided to stop and drink some water. He sat on a large rock and took out his bottle. The cold water felt good in his dry mouth. He looked around and saw that the sun was now high in the sky. He wiped the sweat from his face and continued walking. As the day went on, the heat got stronger. The sun seemed closer, and the air became hotter. Jacob took more water from his bottle, but the bottle was getting lighter. He checked his map to make sure he was going in the right direction. His goal was to reach a small campsite by the end of the day, where he could rest and refill his water. The campsite was supposed to be close, but he saw nothing around him, only the endless sand. Suddenly, he felt something was wrong. He checked his bag again and noticed that his water bottle was almost empty. He had used more water than he planned. The dry heat was taking more energy from him than he thought. He looked around again, trying to find some sign of the campsite. But there was nothing, only more sand. His heart started to beat faster. He knew the desert was dangerous without enough water. Jacob kept walking, but now he was worried. His mouth felt dry and his skin burned under the hot sun. He tried to stay calm, telling himself that the campsite must be near. But with every step, his body felt weaker. The sun seemed never to move, staying high in the sky and making the sand shine like fire. Jacob checked his map again, but it made no sense now. He must have taken a wrong turn. He was lost. His water was gone. He had to make a choice. Should he wait for someone to find him, or should he try to walk and find help? He stood still, thinking. The desert was big, and he was alone. The longer he stayed, the more dangerous it would be. But walking could also be dangerous. He had no water, and the sun was still strong. Finally, Jacob decided he could not just stay there. He had to try and find help. He started walking, but every step felt harder. His legs felt heavy, and his head started to hurt. He looked up at the sky and saw a group of vultures flying above him. They circled slowly, as if they were waiting. Jacob tried to ignore them, but he knew what vultures did. They waited for animals or people to get too weak to move. It was not a good sign. As he kept walking, his vision became blurry. The sand under his feet felt like it was pulling him down. His throat was so dry that he could not even swallow. His head hurt more, and he could feel his heart beating fast in his chest. He tried to keep going, but his legs were too weak. He stumbled and fell to the ground. The hot sand burned his skin, but he could not get up. He tried, but his body would not listen. The vultures were closer now, flying lower in the sky. Jacob closed his eyes and lay still. He had no more strength to move. His mind was cloudy, and he could only hear the sound of the wind and the soft flapping of wings above him. Just as he felt like everything was over, he heard a new sound. It was the sound of an engine getting louder. Jacob opened his eyes a little and saw something moving in the distance. It was an off-road vehicle. He tried to shout, but no sound came out of his dry throat. He could only lift his hand weakly before everything went dark. When Jacob woke up, he was lying in the back of the vehicle. A man was driving, and Jacob could feel the cool air on his face. His throat still hurt, but someone had given him water. The vehicle was moving fast, and Jacob looked out the window. The desert passed by in a blur. "You're lucky we found you," the driver said. "You were pretty close to the end there." Jacob nodded slowly. He was too tired to speak. The vehicle drove on for a few more minutes before it stopped. The driver pointed ahead and said, "See that? You were only a mile away from the campground. You were so close." Jacob looked where the man was pointing. In the distance, he could see a small building and a few tents. It was the campsite he had been looking for. He had been just a short distance away, but the desert had almost beaten him. As the vehicle drove him the rest of the way, Jacob lay back and closed his eyes again. The vultures were gone now, and the desert felt far behind him. He had been saved, but he knew how close he had come to losing everything in that endless sea of sand. The fire in the apartment. Lucas had just finished a long day at college. His apartment was small, but it was enough for him. A quiet place to study, relax, and call home. That night, Lucas was getting ready for bed when he heard a strange noise, a crackling sound like something was burning. He paused and looked around. "Is that fire?" he thought, his heart beginning to race. Suddenly, he smelled smoke. Panic hit him like a wave. His body froze for a moment, then he rushed to the door. He opened it slightly and saw thick, black smoke filling the hallway. The fire was real. The flames were spreading quickly, and the heat was unbearable. Lucas's mind raced. He needed to get out fast. But then he remembered something important: his documents, his passport, his birth certificate, his college papers. They were all in the drawer by his desk. He glanced at the desk, but the fire was getting closer. The smoke was thick now, making it hard to breathe. The room was getting hotter with every second. Lucas coughed and wiped sweat from his face. He knew he had only a few moments to make a decision. "Should I save my documents, or should I just run?" he asked himself, his hand gripping the door handle. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He couldn't decide. He needed those papers, but his life was more important. The smoke was choking him. He covered his mouth with his shirt and took a deep breath. He had to choose now. The flames roared behind him, and he knew time was running out. In that moment, the ceiling above him began to crack. A loud noise echoed through the apartment as part of the ceiling collapsed, sending pieces of wood and plaster crashing to the floor. Lucas jumped back, narrowly avoiding the falling debris. His heart pounded in his chest. The fire was too dangerous. He couldn't stay any longer. "Forget the papers," he thought. "I need to get out." Lucas made his decision. He ran toward the door, pushing through the thick smoke. The air was hot and heavy, but he forced himself to move. The hallway was even worse. Flames were crawling up the walls, and the smoke was so thick that he could barely see. He moved quickly, stumbling as he tried to find his way through the darkness. His hands reached for the walls, guiding him toward the stairs. The heat burned his skin, and every breath felt like it was tearing his lungs apart. Finally, Lucas reached the stairwell. He could hear the fire alarms blaring in the distance, but they sounded so far away. Other people were shouting, their voices filled with panic. He didn't stop. He couldn't. With every step down the stairs, Lucas felt weaker. The smoke was everywhere, and his vision was getting blurry. His legs felt heavy, like they could give out at any moment. But he kept going, knowing that the door to the outside was just a few steps away. As he reached the bottom floor, he could see the exit door. It was only a few feet away. Relief washed over him, but he knew he wasn't safe yet. He pushed through the door and stumbled outside into the cool night air. Lucas collapsed onto the pavement, coughing and gasping for air. His lungs burned, but he was alive. He had made it out. He looked back at the building and saw flames pouring out of the windows. Firefighters were already arriving, spraying water at the burning structure. He touched his arm and winced. His skin was burned, but it wasn't serious. He could feel the heat still on his face, but it didn't matter. He was safe now. He had escaped. As he lay on the ground, catching his breath, a thought crossed his mind. He remembered the wire in his room, the one hanging loose from the wall. He had seen it before, but he never fixed it. He was always too busy, always thinking, "I'll get to it later." But later had come, and it had come in flames. Lucas stared at the building, the fire still roaring inside. He shook his head, knowing that the fire had started from that very wire, the wire he had ignored for weeks. A firefighter came over to check on him. "Are you okay?" the firefighter asked, kneeling beside him. Lucas nodded, still coughing. "Yeah, I'm okay," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He looked back at the building one more time, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The firefighter stood up and motioned for others to help. "You're lucky you got out in time. This fire spread fast." Lucas nodded again, not saying anything. He knew how close he had come. The fire had been right behind him, and he had made it out just in time. The sound of sirens filled the air as more firefighters arrived. He watched them work, spraying water into the building, trying to control the flames. His apartment was gone, and so were all his things, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. As Lucas sat there, breathing in the fresh air, he couldn't stop thinking about the wire. The one thing he had promised himself he would fix, but never did. He didn't know what would happen next. Where would he live? What about his documents? All those questions filled his mind, but for now, he was just thankful to be alive. Drowning at sea. It was a warm day at the beach. The sun was shining, and the waves were perfect. Jack, a young surfer, smiled as he picked up his surfboard. He loved the ocean and spent most of his free time riding the waves. The sound of the water calmed him, and the feeling of gliding across the sea was like no other. Jack waded into the water, feeling the coolness on his feet. He paddled out, waiting for the right wave. After a few minutes, he saw one coming. It was big, and Jack felt a rush of excitement. He stood up on his board, balanced, and rode the wave. The wind blew through his hair, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But then something changed. As Jack turned his board to paddle back to shore, he felt the current pulling him. At first, it wasn't too strong, but soon he realized he was being pulled out to sea. He tried paddling back, but the harder he worked, the stronger the current seemed. Jack was caught in a riptide. His heart began to race. He looked around and saw the beach getting farther away. He knew he had a decision to make. He could keep fighting the current, swimming against it with all his strength, or he could stop and let the riptide take him farther out. He had heard surfers talk about riptides before. Some said you should never fight it, that it was better to save your energy and wait for help. Jack hesitated. The waves were rough, and he was already feeling tired. He had been surfing for a while before this happened. He knew that if he kept fighting the current, he might lose all his strength. But letting it carry him out farther seemed like a dangerous choice, too. What if no one saw him out there? He decided to keep swimming for a bit longer, hoping the current would weaken. With each stroke, his arms felt heavier. The waves slapped against his face, making it hard to breathe. He looked toward the beach, now a small line in the distance. Panic started to set in. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt fear creep into his mind. Jack stopped swimming and took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long. The beach was too far now, and the waves were too strong. He let his body float on the surface for a moment, trying to calm down. The current pulled him farther out, and Jack realized that he had to trust the sea. He couldn't beat it. As he floated, he remembered what someone once told him. Stay calm and don't fight the ocean. It's stronger than you, but if you relax, it will let you go. Jack closed his eyes for a second, trying to slow his breathing. He felt his body move with the water, and while he was scared, he tried not to think about how far he was from shore. He knew he needed to save his energy now. If he was going to survive, he had to be smart about it. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Jack's arms and legs were tired, but he kept himself afloat. Every few moments, he looked around, hoping to see a boat or another surfer. But there was nothing. Just him, the water, and the open sky above. Suddenly, Jack heard something. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. He turned his head and saw a small lifeguard boat in the distance. Relief washed over him, but he couldn't celebrate yet. The boat was still far away. He waved his arms, though it took all his strength to do so. The boat came closer, and Jack saw a lifeguard standing on it. The lifeguard waved back, and Jack felt a surge of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. Help was on the way. The boat reached him, and the lifeguard threw a life ring into the water. Jack grabbed it, feeling the hard plastic in his hands. He was so tired that he could barely hold on, but the lifeguard pulled him toward the boat. With the last bit of his energy, Jack climbed into the boat, collapsing onto the floor. "You're safe now," the lifeguard said, patting Jack on the shoulder. Jack nodded, still trying to catch his breath. As the boat started back toward the shore, Jack looked up at the lifeguard. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice weak. The lifeguard smiled. "We've been using drones. They help us watch the water from above. We saw you before you even knew you were in trouble." Jack stared in surprise. He had no idea they were tracking him all along. All that time he was fighting the sea, thinking he was alone. Someone had been watching. The lifeguard boat had been coming for him the whole time. As the boat reached the beach, Jack looked out at the ocean one last time. He felt exhausted, but he was alive. He had made it. And though the sea had pulled him far away, he had been rescued just in time. Trapped in an avalanche. The sun was shining brightly on the snowy mountains. James, a young skier, was enjoying a perfect day on the slopes. The snow was soft, the sky was clear, and the air was fresh. James had been skiing since he was a child, and he loved the thrill of the speed as he glided down the mountainside. He felt free, as if nothing could stop him. He took a deep breath and continued down the mountain, picking up speed. Suddenly, a loud rumble came from above. James looked up in surprise. The sound grew louder and closer, and before he could react, a massive wall of snow came crashing down the slope. The avalanche hit him with full force, knocking him off his feet. James tried to scream, but the snow swallowed him whole. everything went dark. For a moment, James couldn't think. He was buried under the snow, cold and trapped. The weight of the snow pressed down on him from all sides. He tried to move, but his arms and legs were stuck. Panic started to rise inside him. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe properly, and couldn't call for help. He stopped struggling and tried to calm down. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he knew he had to act fast. His air was limited, and the clock was ticking. "Stay calm," he told himself. "You have to think." James knew that if he didn't get out of the snow soon, he could run out of air. He had two choices. He could wait for help, hoping that someone would find him quickly. But what if no one knew where he was? What if it took too long for help to arrive? His other choice was to try and dig his way out. It was risky. What if he dug in the wrong direction? What if he wasted his energy and air for nothing? He weighed his options quickly. The snow around him was heavy, but he could still move his arms a little. "I have to dig," he thought. "It's my only chance." With the little energy he had left, James began to move his hands through the snow. It was hard to tell which way was up, but he trusted his instincts. Slowly, he started to clear the snow around his face. The air was thin, and every breath felt harder than the last. He moved as quickly as he could, but the snow was heavy, and his arms were getting tired. Minutes passed. His breathing grew more shallow. His lungs burned with the effort. He kept digging, but it was getting harder and harder to move. "Come on," he whispered to himself. "You can do this." Suddenly, his hand broke through something. It felt different from the snow. It was cold, but not as packed. He pushed harder, and then, all at once, the snow above him gave way. Daylight streamed in, blinding him for a moment. James gasped, pulling in deep breaths of the cold mountain air. He had made it. He had broken through to the surface. He pulled himself out of the hole he had dug and lay flat on the snow, breathing heavily and feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. For a long moment, he just lay there, trying to catch his breath and clear his mind. Then, slowly, he sat up and looked around. To his surprise, he wasn't buried deep at all. The snow had only been a foot above him. He was so close to the surface the whole time, but he hadn't known. He shook his head in disbelief. All that panic, all that digging, and he was just a short distance from freedom. James stood up slowly, his legs shaking from the effort. He looked around at the peaceful mountain. The avalanche was over, and everything seemed calm again. He took a deep breath and smiled slightly. He had made it through. Far in the distance, he could see a group of skiers coming down the mountain. Maybe they would have found him if he had waited. But in that moment, James knew that he couldn't have waited. He had to act, even if the snow was only a foot thick. It had been a choice between action and fear. James turned and began to walk toward the ski lodge, his legs still weak but steady. He was alive, and that was all that mattered now. He kept walking, step by step, the mountain quiet behind him, the dinner crisis. It was a quiet evening at Sarah's house. As a single parent, she was used to taking care of everything on her own. Her young son, Ethan, was playing in the living room with his toy cars, making engine sounds while Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen. The smell of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the small house, and everything seemed normal, as always. Sarah hummed softly as she cut some bread and placed it on the table. She had a long day at work, and dinner time was her moment to relax a little before getting Ethan ready for bed. She sat down at the table and took a bite of the chicken. It tasted perfect, just the right mix of spices and tenderness. She smiled, proud of her cooking. However, a moment later, something went terribly wrong. Suddenly, Sarah felt a sharp pain in her throat. The food was stuck. She tried to cough, but no sound came out. Her eyes widened in panic. She was choking, and there was no one else in the house but her and Ethan. Sarah stood up quickly, knocking her chair over. She clutched her throat, her breath coming in short gasps. Her mind raced. What should she do? She couldn't scream for help. The nearest neighbor was too far, and her phone was on the kitchen counter, completely out of reach. Ethan was only 4 years old. He wouldn't know how to help. He was just a child. She glanced toward the living room. Ethan was still playing with his cars, not aware of what was happening. Time was running out. Sarah's thoughts sped through her options. She remembered reading about the Heimlich maneuver. Could she do it on herself? She didn't have time to wait. Her vision started to blur slightly as she felt the air being trapped inside her. Desperate, she grabbed a nearby chair. Holding onto the back of the chair, Sarah pushed her stomach against the edge as hard as she could. The first push did nothing. She tried again, using more force. Still, nothing. Panic took over, and her hands began to shake. She slammed herself harder against the chair, her mind screaming that this was her only chance. On the third try, something changed. She felt the piece of chicken dislodge from her throat. A painful cough followed, and she gasped for air, collapsing to the floor in exhaustion. Breathing heavily, Sarah felt the cool air finally filling her lungs again. Relief washed over her, but she was too weak to stand up immediately. For a few moments, she just lay there, catching her breath. Her heart was pounding, and her head was spinning. Suddenly, she heard a small voice. "Mommy, are you okay?" Ethan stood at the doorway, his big eyes full of worry. He held a toy car in one hand and a phone in the other. Sarah gave him a weak smile, her throat still sore from the ordeal. "Yes, sweetie, I'm okay," she whispered. Ethan walked closer and held out the phone. "I called 911, Mommy," he said softly. Sarah blinked, confused. "You what?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I called 911, Ethan repeated, like they do on TV when someone is hurt. Sarah's eyes widened. She took the phone from his small hand and looked at the screen. Sure enough, the emergency number was dialed. She could hear a voice coming from the speaker. 911, what's your emergency? Sarah, still in shock, quickly explained what had happened to the operator. She assured them that everything was okay now and that she didn't need an ambulance. The operator stayed on the line for a few more moments to make sure Sarah was truly fine before ending the call. As she hung up the phone, Sarah stared at her son in disbelief. Ethan had saved her. Even though he was too young to help physically, his quick thinking had made all the difference. She pulled him into a tight hug, her body still trembling from the experience. "You're a smart boy," Sarah whispered into his hair, feeling the tears in her eyes but holding them back. Ethan just smiled up at her, his little hands still clutching his toy car. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he knew that his mom was okay now, and that's all that mattered to him. Sarah slowly got to her feet, still feeling a little weak. She looked around the kitchen, the half-eaten dinner still on the table. Her stomach turned, and she knew she wouldn't be finishing that meal tonight. Instead, she led Ethan back to the living room, where they both sat on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background. Sarah felt exhausted but grateful to be there, with her son sitting safely beside her. She ran her hand through his soft hair, thinking about how differently things could have ended. A knock at the door pulled Sarah out of her thoughts. She opened it to find 2 paramedics standing outside. "We got a call about a choking emergency," one of them said. Sarah smiled weakly and nodded. "That was my son. I'm okay now, but thank you for coming," she said. The paramedics checked her over to make sure she was really all right before leaving. As they walked away, Sarah couldn't help but feel amazed. Ethan had watched enough TV shows about emergencies to know what to do. In his young mind, he had remembered the most important lesson: call for help.